We are now joined by a very special guest. He's a WAER alum. Not sure if this is his first appearance on the Ostrom Avenue podcast. Could have been on in the early days of the show. It's Syracuse football host and sideline reporter Tim Leonard. Tim, how are you on this Wednesday morning?
Great to be here with you guys, bringing back some memories. I think I have been on the podcast before, and the reason why I say that is because one of my good pals in my senior year class, when I graduated in 2020, the very lucky year to graduate right in the middle of the pandemic, but one of my good pals, Brendan Mortensen, I believe was the one who came up with the idea. And I don't know if that was just before COVID or the exact timetable is probably blurring together a little bit, but I'm sure I've been on in some form or fashion. And now it's cool to see that it's continued since then.
Yep. Brendan Mortensen is known as the pod father here on the Ostrom Avenue podcast. And I know he's doing great things down in Baltimore. Let's shift to Syracuse football, Tim, being someone who's around the team a lot and got to watch the win against Colgate up close. We don't need to dive into the super specifics of a 65-0 victory, but what were your main takeaways from the game?
Yeah, you can only learn so much when it's Colgate, I guess. But I thought Syracuse passed with flying colors. They were supposed to take care of business. First drive comes out, looks a little shaky. Talked to Garrett Schrader this week. He said he missed a couple throws on the first drive, and then from there he kind of settled in, and he's finding Aronde Gadsden with a lot of his first couple series. And it was cool to see after kind of the opening series, Syracuse really spread the ball around and get others some confidence. Guy like Amari Hatcher, who, we've heard good things from. We know he's a talented guy. He's, for Syracuse standards, a pretty solid recruit at the wide receiver position, a speedster. And it sounds like, Dino Babers put it pretty bluntly with him in particular after the game that he cleaned up his nightlife. He's a little bit more focused this year. And that's a guy we've had the conversation throughout camp. Who's the number 2 wide receiver? I think it's Damian Alford is kind of the answer right now, or the best bet to be that answer. But, it'd be nice if the conversation then shifts to who could be a very solid number 3 option, who could be a very solid number 4 option. And it is Colgate, but I feel like Syracuse's wide receiver position in particular, that's a big takeaway for me. I come out of that game feeling better about that. And the Quinn Allen looked good as well. So, there's still some things that I think you went in with the question mark. Okay, how is the offensive line going to look? It's hard to really gauge after week 1, but there were some penalties. They're dealing with some injuries there. So going forward, I think that's still the overarching key to the season, and that still is a question mark, and you can only learn so much. But I liked what I saw from the wide receivers.
You mentioned Amari Hatcher as standout that maybe necessarily wasn't looked at in the two deep. Were there any more kind of backups that got playing time that really stood out to you on Saturday?
Probably an easy answer here, but Ike Daniels. I know he just claimed the ACC Rookie of the Week. That came out, I think, yesterday officially. But he's a guy that I was sort of wondering who would be the third running back. And there are a couple freshmen that I think are vying for that spot. But we've heard good things about Ike Daniels, and I thought he did look good. Deeper down the depth chart, I thought some of the guys in the secondary flashed a little bit. I wouldn't say, Derek McDonald is deeper down the depth chart. He's a starting linebacker, but to me, him and Leon Lowry did some really nice things in that game. And you got what you expected from the linebacker position. And honestly, from my vantage point, I was just more curious. And some of the guys that we did not see on the 2 deep in the spots that we thought maybe, a guy like Terry Lockett, who's coming off an injury, good to see him out there. That means that, okay, it's not like it's a lingering issue. It seems like maybe he's working his way back from the injury a little bit. I know he missed time during camp, but it was good to see him. Josh Eloa is a guy who I know missed some time during camp. He's fighting for that starting center spot. It was good to see him. Steph Thompson was out there. And Dino Babers told us on the Monday press conference before week 1 that it wasn't a case of Steph Thompson not being healthy. It was more just Leon Lowry was out playing him. So it seems like that's sort of a tactic of motivation probably to get to Steph Thompson, because we know he has a lot in the tank, and we've seen him be one of the better linebackers at Syracuse before a couple of seasons ago. So it was good to see, some guys deeper down the depth chart that I was wondering how healthy are they. For the most part, everyone played that I had a question mark about, outside of, I guess, Trevor Pena, Joe Moore, the guys that we knew were going to be out.
Yeah, who played and who didn't play was going to be a very interesting storyline coming into the week. I think the Trevor Pena news caught a lot of people by surprise the Monday before Colgate when he wasn't on the depth chart, didn't end up playing. It is looking very doubtful, like he'll play against Western Michigan this upcoming Saturday. But some of the bigger names that had, prominent injuries, Garrett Schrader obviously recovering still from off-season elbow surgery. You mentioned how you talked to him. How is he recovering this week after playing, I guess, one drive into the third quarter? So a little over a half of football. And then his top target as well, Oronde Gadsden, turned an ankle in practice a couple of weeks ago. Didn't really look to be 100%, but everything that Dino Babers is saying about him seems fine. What are your takes on how probably Syracuse's two most important offensive players played?
Yeah, I was very curious to see how Garrett Schrader would look just throwing the football. Would it look natural? Would it look like he's in any pain at all? He is saying, and he's pretty adamant that, the pitch count stuff is kind of over with now, and he feels really good. And I think overall, a lot of the chatter right now is sort of going into the season, how healthy is he for week 1, week 2? But Garrett Schrader himself is very happy that he did do this surgery because Western Michigan's the opponent this week. They should take care of them, even if he's at, say, 95, 90%. The idea is you want him to be 100% come Clemson. And then, I think he's been pretty open about how he wants to still be there for the final 4 weeks of the season. When you get into November, that's a key this season for Syracuse. And that's been a key ever since I've been following Syracuse football with Dungy. And, that's the question mark every year. How healthy can the quarterback that's kind of a dual threat guy and aggressive runner stay? And how much can the offensive line avoid being banged up so they can protect him and the trickle down effect of that? So I think Garrett Schrader's doing well. Oronde Gadsden, he did look not 100%, and he gave himself up, I thought, a little bit earlier than he would have on a couple plays. Some of that is why take some extra hits against Colgate when you've got the game in hand. Now, on the other hand, I know Gadsden did not play the final drive of the first half, but I was under the impression and just sort of guessing, not knowing anything, that he was maybe just going to play like 1 or 2 drives. I don't know what the total was, but it's probably more in the neighborhood of 5 or 6. So I guess that's a good sign. And he was still, effective when he was out there. So I'm not awfully worried about his injury. It feels like it's, like you said, something in the neighborhood of a rolled ankle or whatever. And it should just sort of get better and better as time passes. And honestly, it's kind of a luxury not to just look past Western Michigan. I know that's not what you ever want to do in football, but Syracuse's opening schedule, we can all admit, is a little bit easier, and it's sort of ramping up in competition. So if you've got Schrader, if you've got Gadsden still dealing with some injuries, that's not the end of the world right now.
You mentioned it, the schedule a lot easier to begin the year than last year. Last year, you start week 1 in the Dome against Louisville, a conference opponent. Obviously, I think this year it works because your quarterback is coming off of an injury. But do you think that starting off with 2 easier opponents could cause a little bit of lackadaisical approach, kind of getting into those big games because it's their first time in prime time or against bigger opponents?
I guess it could. I mean, I think, and the other point to bring up when you're talking about the schedule and how it sets up well, maybe for this particular group, I think it's good for the offensive line, because if they went out and they played, let's say, Clemson, which I guess maybe isn't the best example based on how Clemson looked in week 1, but say they had an opener against an ACC team like a Pittsburgh, Clemson, one of those teams that, you're an underdog going in. I would be worried, I think, about how the offensive line, with some new pieces, guys that are banged up, guys that are still trying to figure out what is their role, where do they slot in. I'd be worried about how they would look against really good competition out of the gate. So on top of the Schrader, Gadsden, little owies, as Dino calls them, I think that's another key piece to consider here. And, as far as not having a letdown, like, these guys, they're hungry to prove that last season and the way it ended is a fluke, and it was more based on injuries than anything. And these guys are really confident. I do get a sense, being around this group, that the chemistry is really good. And Garrett Schrader's not thinking about just getting to a bowl game this year. He said that he promised a bowl game, and he almost sort of scoffed at the question from a standpoint of, I don't know why that is the question going into the season, because he has bigger expectations, he has bigger goals, and so does a lot of the team members, and that's a good way of thinking of it. So you got to take care of business against Western Michigan, and I'm sure they're treating it like any other game. But all in all, the way the schedule shapes up, it's easy to get ahead of yourself in college football and start counting wins as wins, and you don't want to ever do that. But it does feel like Syracuse is in a good spot to start 3-0, 4-0, something in that neighborhood.
You mentioned building up Western Michigan. How much of a step up is that from Colgate in terms of a test? I know you look at the spread. Syracuse was about a 40-point favorite against Colgate. I saw the lines opened around 20 for Western Michigan. So that tells you something. Do you think this is a game where Syracuse's starters are once again out of the question by the fourth quarter, or is this going to be a much more difficult test than the Raiders were?
Yeah, it's a step up, but I don't think it compares to the previous times we played Western Michigan, which I believe, 2019 season, Tommy DeVito's first full year as a starter, they went to Western Michigan. I'm trying to remember the exact timeline. There was 2 games in there when I was a student, but anyway, they won both of them pretty easily, and they were 4 to 5 point favorites in both of those games. Western Michigan, I was going through their recent success, and it makes you just scratch your head and wonder why Tim Lester was fired. And there's a little bit of Syracuse bias there, I'm sure. And he was the offensive coordinator here for a while, recruited Eric Dungy, did some nice things for Syracuse. And I get that PJ Fleck had the boat rowing and things were trending up for Western Michigan when Tim Lester took the job. But he had his first losing season last year. 2 years ago, they went on the road and beat Pittsburgh in an early season matchup. Not a great Pittsburgh team, but I just think they had one bad year under him, really, and he was doing a great job. So now they're kind of in a rebuilding phase. I mean, honestly, they're one of the worst teams in the MAC on paper. They only have 2 returning starters on defense. So if you're an average Syracuse fan, or if you're just a Syracuse fan that doesn't really pay attention to Western Michigan, which is pretty typical, you're probably thinking, oh, this is definitely a step up in competition. And I think the way you summarize it with the spread there is a better indication of how much it goes up in competition. This is still very much a game that Syracuse should have in hand in the fourth quarter. Western Michigan just played St. Francis, PA last week in FCS school. They won the game, but it was, I think, 35-17, somewhere in that neighborhood was the final. So not a resounding win. Obviously, Western Michigan is going to come in hungry. They're the underdog. They have nothing to lose. All of those things still factor in, and you want to get off to a good start. You want to make sure some of those penalties that were sort of inexcusable do not rear its head again. But I do think this is a game that Syracuse, if they play the way that we know they're capable of playing, if they play their game, they should have it in hand in the fourth quarter.
You mentioned how the team doesn't look forward going to the rest of the schedule. As the media, we can do that. So looking at Purdue, lost to Fresno State, BC lost to Northern Illinois, Clemson lost to Duke, 3 Syracuse opponents losing to teams that they should have beat in week 1. Does that necessarily affect kind of how you look at it in terms of the way Syracuse can accumulate wins to get to a bowl game? And does it change kind of your record prediction that maybe you were thinking in your head at the beginning of the season?
I think it's easy to overreact to week 1. So it doesn't really change my record prediction too much. There were some good results from a Syracuse standpoint, like some teams that maybe didn't look as good. I mean, I'd even include Army. They lose to Louisiana Monroe. Not that we were expecting Army to be a game that Syracuse would struggle with all that much. And same goes for the whole approach to Western Michigan. You want to treat every game seriously and take care of business. But there also were sort of the flip side, like Florida State looks like a college football playoff team based on the second half. So that's a game that you were probably thinking was an L at Florida State. That's probably definitely going to be an L now based on week 1 overreaction, right? And UNC looked pretty good. So I think in general, it probably made me a little bit more optimistic about where Syracuse stands in the ACC. It's a good thing, I guess, that they're not playing Duke this year, and Duke in other years has been considered a pretty easy win. Georgia Tech later in the year is a game that I've pointed to as one of those that I feel like could be tougher than people are expecting. I don't really know what to make of how they played and how Louisville played, and it seems like we just need to put a pin in that one and wait to see how Georgia Tech develops. But I am thinking that Georgia Tech's going to be a little bit better than expected, and it's a road game later in the year. So the schedule overall, it does feel like there's more potential to win games in November than what we've seen. They don't have the tough stretch is really in October, and it's a tough stretch for sure, that 3-game stretch, even the way that Clemson looked. You got Clemson at home, you got UNC, you got Florida State on the road. That's going to be really tough. But I do feel like the other games outside of those, you're, if anything, feeling better about them coming out of week 1.
You mentioned playing on the road in November. The month of November has not been very kind to Dino Babers in his tenure. Playing on the road has not been very kind to Dino Babers during his tenure at Syracuse. Speaking of him, he hired 2 new coordinators on offense and defense before this season. Tim, what do you make of Jason Beck, Rocky Long, how they performed? I know Dino said he would give Rocky Long an A after the performance of the defense in week 1. And yes, they were playing Colgate. They were very dominant. I think they should have been dominant based on the performance by the Colgate offense. What are you looking from those guys as the season progresses? How much do you think we saw from them in their system in week 1 compared to, maybe breaking out the full playbook as we move forward in the season?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's not the answer you guys are looking for, not the answer that we want, but you just really can't tell much from Colgate week 1. And when it comes to Jason Beck, at least, I think, Syracuse's defense, I would say A is a fair grade for Rocky Long. And talking to the players, it does seem like they all say the same thing. Everyone's been asking, what are the differences between Rocky Long and Tony White? I know it's the same defense, but how is it different? And they're like, well, the terminology is a little bit different, a little more nitpicking. Derek McDonald, I chatted with this week, and he said that Rocky Long, one of the differences is in practice, he'll call for a play that they haven't run in like 2-3 years and just try and keep them on their toes, basically keep them, fresh on all of the playbook, I guess. But I think it was probably overblown, if anything, how Syracuse had to replace 2 coordinators, right? Because, I read a lot of preseason magazines like you guys did and evaluating, okay, where does Syracuse stack up in the ACC? And I think if you are an outsider, if you're a national college football writer, you say, man, Syracuse lost a lot of games finishing the season. They go 7-6. They lose some pieces to the transfer portal that were talented. And they lose their 2 top coordinators. Not ideal. But really, Robert and I's offense is Jason Beck's offense. And Garrett Schrader, for the first time in his career, does not have to learn a whole new offense in the offseason. So, yes, there's going to be maybe a learning curve, and there's slight differences between how Jason Beck will call plays and how Robert and I will call plays. But maybe they'll be better. Maybe it'll be just the same. Who knows? I think in general, going from the same offense to the same offense is more important than switching offensive coordinators. That's the key for Schrader, is he doesn't have to learn a whole new playbook, learn a whole new system. And then on defense, Rocky Long is basically the godfather, as it's been said a ton, of the 3-3-5. So it might even be a step up from Tony White. I love Tony White. I think he was a great hire, and Syracuse's defense was clicking at a level I haven't really seen under him. But I'm confident that this will not be a step down with Rocky Long, and I think all the players have said that too.
You mentioned Tony White, something that seemed to happen every year with his defense, whether it be because of injuries or more film being found on Syracuse, was towards the end of the season, or even, as games went on, as you got into the fourth quarter, maybe it was because of time of possession or other factors, Syracuse's defense started to wear down. And specifically in the secondary is where those injuries kept on popping up year after year. It was, in 2021, it's Andre Sisco and Trill Williams go down. And then last year, it's Garrett Williams goes down with a season-ending injury. I think the cornerbacks were a position group coming into the year. People were talking about as, this is a very unproven group. I know Isaiah Johnson is a captain and he played some last year, but for the relative most part, it is an unproven group. How do you think Syracuse's defense and specifically those cornerbacks can be better positioned for success under Rocky Long as games go on and as the season goes on?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it's the whole Syracuse problem is they've worn down the injuries in November. So, I think Dino, to his credit, has done a very good job at realizing what are my flaws and honestly taking some ego hit, I guess, in a way. Like, he came in, right? He was known for the offense and wanted to instill this orange is the new fast offense. He realized, and it takes some credit, or you got to give him some credit for realizing that actually, this isn't the best thing for my personnel. It's not giving me the results I want necessarily. We're going to shift offenses. We're going to bring in Robert and I. He realized after Brian Ward was the first defensive coordinator that wasn't really working, shifted to a totally new defense. And he's been flexible as the head coach. He's made different hires. He's tweaked things. He's evaluated things. I know fans were on him forever about not having a special teams coach. Now they have a special teams coach. So, you can always find nitpicks and stuff, but it feels like they've been good, relatively speaking, at figuring out what are their weaknesses and trying to fix that. And I know they're doing some things from a training staff health perspective to try to make sure that they are in it for the long haul this season. Seems like Garrett Schrader is more committed to that. Seems like Aronde Gadsden, by giving up on a couple of plays, might be more committed to that. So that's all good. You hope that it translates. Some of it is just luck, honestly. Like there were some fluke injuries in week 1 last year. It wasn't necessarily because they were breaking down, but Steph Thompson goes out. And I do think this year's team is probably better equipped to handle injuries because they are going to happen. That's definitely a consensus among the players and the coaches, is that this is probably the deepest team that Dino has had from 2s and 3s on the depth chart standpoint. So that's exciting. And maybe a reason why they're deeper is because a lot of those guys had to play last year because of all the injuries. So now they come into this year with some experience. So I don't know. I feel like Syracuse is better equipped for November than they have been in a while. But you say all that and injuries can happen and you can get unlucky. And I mean, honestly, guys, it's sad to say, but Garrett Schrader goes down and this team, the whole perception of the team changes very quickly. I think Carlos Del Rio Wilson did some good things. And there are some fans out there that probably want Carlos Del Rio Wilson to be the starter. I get that that's going to happen at any team, but I do feel like Syracuse, like any team, is still vulnerable to an injury at the quarterback position. They're vulnerable to an injury at a major position. Offensive line, I mean, they're already dealing with some injuries, and I don't know how much deeper you can go and feel confident in what you have there because there are some unproven guys there. So Dino has said it's not so much about how many injuries, but where are your injuries? And as long as Syracuse gets through the season without key injuries to those position groups that I mentioned, then I think they're going to be in a better spot.
You mentioned having one of the deepest teams in the Dino Babers era, and that's been a struggle in terms of building a sustainable program. They get to a bowl game in 2018, have a couple down years, then get to a bowl game last year. Is Dino Babers on the right track in terms of getting players experience, building it through recruiting high school and getting some transfer guys to building a sustainable program going forward?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, the recruiting class coming up, it's sort of weird to me, but it's probably the best recruiting class they've had under Dino, which you'd think just logically, Dino's contract is more of a discussion each year, and we know where it stands, and we know that at some point, John Wildhack's going to make a decision, maybe after this season, considering it's, I think, well known, or it's been sort of rumored that there's more than 1 year left on the deal. John Wildhack has said that. So maybe it's 2, maybe it's 3, who knows? But it's probably, you want to, at the end of this year, make a decision. Either is he the guy for the future? Because then if you present that he has job security, it's better for recruiting. But even though the job security is a question mark still, from an outsider's standpoint, the recruiting has been pretty good this year. So I can't really make sense of that. They lost some key recruiters, and it seems like they're still doing well there. I don't know how much of that is the recruiting rankings will change or whatever as time passes. And it seems like Syracuse sometimes gets off to a good start because they have a volume of recruits and then other teams catch up. We'll see where it all shakes out. But I do think Dino is the right type of leader for this program and the right type of guy in terms of he always recruits a certain type of guy that comes in and works really hard and has the right mindset and fits the culture. And that's key, because if you are Syracuse, like look at Duke, guys. I feel like a lot of chatter after the Duke Clemson game week 1 is about how Dabo Swinney and Clemson are not embracing the transfer portal and they're falling apart. But we got to give credit to Duke as well, and Mike Elko, who comes in, and they don't have 4 or 5 stars necessarily. They do have Riley Leonard, who Syracuse recruited hard. And, we got two Leonards on this podcast here. It would have been nice to have a Leonard at QB1. That's unfortunate, but it does feel like Duke is more just doing it with culture, right? So it proves that it can be done. And I think Dino has done a good job of Ohana, La Familia. It's all said probably too much, but they do have a good culture building. The question is, can you stay healthy? Can you figure out some of the issues that have plagued you in the past? And, they're trying all they can to do that. So we'll see.
Those questions are so fascinating, and it's excruciating that we have to wait so long to get them answered. But I guess that's the excitement of football season. One more for you, Tim, as an AER alum, this being the exclusive podcast of WAER Sports. What is your I know you talked about graduating in 2020, obviously not the most ideal scenario, but as a member of WAER Sports, what's your foremost WAER memory?
That's a tough question. Too many memories to count, as you guys know. Honestly, like it's sad that this is the first thing that comes to mind, but probably being at the ACC tournament my senior year when COVID happened, because like everyone, what was it, March 12th, March 13th, whatever the date was, we all remember where we were when Rudy Gobert did his press conference or it leaked and Tom Hanks news comes out and, it just spiraled out of control very quickly. And I was a senior there for the ACC tournament. The first night I was doing stuff, not for AER, actually for Orange Fizz, who I don't know how many of you guys or some of your friends probably work for Orange Fizz. So I'm sitting courtside doing that and I'm on my phone. And that was, Syracuse beat UNC in a surprising game. The Orange were not a tournament team. It was Elijah Hughes's last year. And they had never really beaten UNC, a team they've always struggled against when it was Roy Williams. He always figured out ways to beat the zone. And they crushed him by like 30 points. There were fans. It was a packed house. But also every fan is down at their phone at halftime looking at all this wild COVID news that's coming out and knowing that this is probably going to be it for at least, to what extent we didn't know. We figured this was going to be the last game with spectators for a while. And the NBA did suspend their season in the middle of that game, I think, that night. So then the next morning I wake up and there was the Packer and Durham radio show was on at like 9 a.m. live from the ACC tournament. They had the ACC commissioner Swafford on, John Swafford, and he announced that the tournament was still on. Syracuse was going to play Louisville that night at 8 p.m. or whatever the scheduled tip-off was. And I was doing that game. So I'm sitting there with my buddy Jack McMullen, who is the sports director. We're getting ready. And we're like, do we make our charts? Like, it feels inevitable that this is going to be canned. They announced that there were going to be no fans. So literally, guys, I'm walking out of the hotel doors to go to the stadium for that first game, which now we remember is the game where Florida State is warming up and then they get the trophy. And it's just really odd to look at. But I was just like, man, I'm kind of intrigued. If this tournament is going to happen, I'm just going to get there early because I have the pass and just see what sports is like without fans and, report on it for WAER a little bit. And we were walking out. I think we were waiting for the Uber and, it became official. I think the Big East stopped play at halftime. So that's a sad memory in a way because it put an abrupt ending to my college career. But it was also kind of a poetic ending because, I'm with everyone that I spent so much time with. I was doing sports stuff. I was doing what I came to Syracuse to do in a way. So too many other good memories. I mean, beating Clemson was awesome. That was my sophomore to junior year. And I remember doing an 8 a.m. radio show the next morning on very little sleep after that and getting through it. So a lot of good times for sure. But, to you guys, just cherish every moment because there's nothing like WAER and kind of the friendships that you build. That's still probably the best thing about going to Syracuse is I'm still in touch with all the guys in my grade and the grade above me and the grade below me. And that's what's really cool about it.
Couldn't have said it better any other way. Tim, thank you so much for your insight, your time, your stories. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, hopefully I wasn't too long-winded or anything, but I appreciate you guys having me on. And anytime if you want me to hop back on, I'm always happy to do it. Always happy to try and pretend like I'm still at WAER and reliving some of those memories.
Of course. Thanks again.
Yep. Thanks, guys.